Darkness. Complete, all-consuming darkness. Michelle Hoffman never forgot her first encounter with it. I remember being excited about my first year at Camp Scott because the woods are so dark at night, she recalls. If you've never camped in a tent in the deep woods, it's a little scary. After your first camp, you'll be ready. You know it's going to be dark and gloomy. For Girl Scouts, dark nights were part of the experience at Camp Scott, where they spent 2 weeks of the summer each year. Michelle first went to camp at age 9, and she loved it. Swimming, hiking, camping. She was happy to return every summer, but Michelle's 7th summer was different. At 15, she was almost an adult, no longer a Girl Scout, but a young assistant to the camp director. Something else had changed too, though she didn't know it yet. Contrary to her childhood imagination, no night before that June of '77 had ever really held any real horrors. But in the summer of '77, a monster lurked in the darkness of the night that had never before disturbed the peace of Camp Scott. On the morning of Sunday, June 12th, when Michelle arrived at the camp headquarters in Tulsa, the parking lot was already full. There were 140 girls preparing for the trip to camp, but one in particular stood out, Michelle says, recalling her first meeting with Denise Milner. The 10-year-old was about to go to camp for the first time, and it was obvious that she was nervous. Doris Denise Milner had worked hard to sell enough cookies to attend camp for the first time. Her friends had decided not to go that year, so she was a little nervous, but still excited about the opportunity to make new friends. Michelle came over and introduced herself to Denise and her mother, Betty Milner. Betty explained that the girl had gotten scared at the last minute and didn't want to go to camp anymore. I convinced the girl to sit next to me on the bus. Her mother asked me to call her if she was sad at camp the next day, and I assured her I would. But I was confident I wouldn't have to, because the counselors were doing everything they could to make sure the girls had a great time, Michelle recalls. I kept saying, "You're going to love it. You're going to have a great time." Michelle, who was 15 herself, was sincere and meant it. After saying their final goodbyes, 140 scouts boarded buses for the trip to the small farming community of Lacoste Grove, about 50 miles northeast in Oklahoma, where the Girl Scouts owned 410 acres known as Camp Scott. Since 1928, Camp Scott has provided girls with a variety of recreational and educational activities, including hiking, swimming, arts and crafts, picnics, and singing in the great outdoors. The 2 weeks of camp offered relaxation, friendship, and excitement. On the outskirts of Locomotive Grove, the buses turned south at an intersection of 2 roads. A green sign directed drivers down a narrow road called the Cookie Trail to the Girl Scouts campsite. The camp was divided into sections named for the Native American tribes of Osage, Chickasaw, Creek, Seminole, Choctaw, Comanche, Cherokee, Quapaw, Arapaho, and most remotely, Kiowa. There were 27 girls assigned to the Kiowa section, which was located at the western end of the campground. The last tent in the section was Tent 8. The 3.5-by-4- tropical tent was on a wooden platform 90 meters from the nearest counselor's tent and 23 meters from the nearest neighboring tent. Denise Milner was assigned Tent 8, along with 9-year-old Michelle Goose and Lori Lee Farmer, who would be celebrating her 9th birthday later that week. The 4th girl was supposed to join them the next day. Michelle Hoffman helped Dennis get used to the camp, leading her to tent number 8. She even admitted that it was once her favorite tent. As the Girl Scouts were eating dinner in the dining hall at about 6 p.m., a thunderstorm broke out. After dinner, the girls wanted to wait for the rain to stop, but it kept pouring and pouring, so everyone went to their tents. Denise, Lori, and Michelle unpacked their things and started getting ready for bed. Denise quickly made friends with her tent mates and told them about her family. In turn, Lori said she was a big sister to her 4 siblings. Michelle came from Broken Bow, but found it easy to get along with Denise and Lori, who came from Stalsey. Lori unpacked 2 decks of cards and wrote a letter to her family before the lights went out. "I made 2 new friends," she wrote. "We share a tent, we sleep on camp beds. I couldn't wait to write to you. Love, Lori." Michelle Hoffman returned to the tent once more to check on the girls. They were getting ready for bed and seemed to have settled into their new surroundings. "Good night, see you in the morning," she said to Dennis. A few minutes later, she climbed into her own bed. Despite the storm, the first day had gone well, and she was confident that everyone would be well rested and ready for more adventures on Monday. At about 1:30 a.m. on June 13th, Carla Sue Wilhite, a camp counselor, grabbed a flashlight and went to check out a suspicious intermittent moaning sound that seemed to be coming from somewhere near the intersection of the camp trail and the dirt road leading to the parking lot. The sounds were about 140 meters away from 10-8. When Carla couldn't find the source of the noise, she decided it was just animals in the woods and there was no reason to raise the alarm. So she went back to her tent and slept. At 2 in the morning, one of the Girl Scouts in Tent 7 saw someone pull back the tent flap and shine a light inside. She couldn't see the person's features, only that it was the silhouette of a large man. The flap closed again and the unknown person left. At 3 o'clock in the morning, a girl in the Cherokee section of the camp heard a scream coming from the direction of the Kiowa camp. Another girl in Quapaw also heard someone calling for her mother, and she thought she recognized the voice of Lori Farmer, with whom she had once camped. The girl knew that Lori sometimes had nightmares, so she saw no reason to raise the alarm and went back to sleep. The foul weather had cleared overnight, and Monday morning was bright and clear. It was the kind of morning when you breathe in a breath of fresh air with pleasure. The forest was clean and fresh. The earth smelled good. It was supposed to be a wonderful day. At 6 in the morning, Carla woke up and went to take a shower. When she approached the place where the strange sounds came from during the night, she saw 3 sleeping bags lying under a tree. One was yellow with a checkered pattern. The second was green, and the third had flowers on it. Upon examining them more closely, Carla was horrified to see the lifeless body of Denise Milner, partially covered by a yellow sleeping bag. In the other sleeping bags, Carla found Michelle and Lori. The counselors responded quickly, but nothing in the Girl Scout handbook could have prepared them for something like this. They were still responsible for all the other girls at camp, and they gathered them in the dining hall for breakfast. In an attempt to protect them from trauma, the counselors pretended that everything was normal. Within minutes, the first officers arrived on the scene, cordoned off the murder scene, and kept journalists away while they collected evidence. However, it didn't take long for the world to learn of the tragic incident. At 8 a.m. on Monday, June 13th, as Tulsa residents began another work week, the first news broke. It seemed so unbelievable that many asked a second and third time before they were sure they had it right. 3 Girl Scouts had been found dead at Camp Scott. At first, no one knew if a crime had been committed or an accident, but soon new details emerged and they were shocking. Michelle and Lori had been killed by violent blows, and Denise, although her face had also been damaged, had died of strangulation, but not before they had been abused. The police were looking for the killer or killers. Michelle Hoffman answered the phone that terrible day. It rang all day, without stopping. She got home only in the evening and finally gave in to her tears. But the worst blow was not to come until a few days later. She was sitting with her parents in the living room, reading the newspaper with the latest news about the murders. She looked at the photos of the girls and read the names: Lori Lee Farmer, Michelle Goose, Taurus Denise Milner. And suddenly she felt very sick. She remembered the bus ride, the little scared girl, and her last words, "Good night, see you in the morning." It all came back to her suddenly. Until then, the girl's first name, Taurus, had blinded her to the truth. "Oh no, Mom," the girl cried. "That's the girl I was riding the bus with. That's Denise." The triple murder of the Girl Scouts stirred up memories of another high-profile case in the United States, the murder of a girl counselor, Peggy Beck, which was remarkably similar to the cases of Denise, Michelle, and Lori. Peggy Beck was 16 years old on August 17, 1963. She was a camp counselor at Flying Ranch in the Pike National Forest southwest of Denver. It's easy to picture the landscape: craggy mountains and tranquil lakes surrounded by Douglas fir and magical yellow pine. The girl's real name was Margaret, but she preferred Peggy. She was a student at Denver High School, enjoying the last few weeks of summer vacation before she had to return to school. It was Sunday evening, and everyone was packing up for the trip home the next day. That night, she took part in the campfire songs. Maybe she told the other children scary stories based on urban legends. And if she chose to tell such a story, she probably did it with emotion, changing her voice and intonation so that the children would feel the full horror of what was happening in the story. No one could have known that they were only a few hours away from a true horror story. Once the fire songs were sung, the boys settled into their sleeping bags and Peggy returned to her tent. There were 24 children and 3 adults in the group, but Peggy's tent was said to be 30 feet from the rest of the group. Usually she didn't sleep alone, but with her friend Claudia Schreit. But Claudia felt unwell and decided to spend the night in the infirmary. The next morning, Peggy didn't show up for breakfast, so Claudia went to wake her, but Peggy couldn't be woken up. She was dead. Initially, it was believed that she had died of natural causes, but on August 21st, 1963, the coroner stated that finger marks had been found on the girl's throat, which had not immediately become apparent. The coroner concluded that the girl had been molested and strangled. During the initial investigation, the police had no reason to suspect anyone connected with the camp. If you think about it for a second, the circumstances of the girl's death were horrific. How did the killer know that she was sleeping alone in the tent that night? He must have been watching her. Was he waiting nearby, watching from the safe cover of the forest? When she entered the tent alone just before midnight, the predator was watching, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. Did he suddenly appear in her tent while she was sleeping? Did he put his hand on her face to stop her from calling for help from the other counselors just 30 feet away? We know that Peggy put up a violent fight and that she likely had bits of the gunman's skin under her fingernails because newspapers reported that investigators were looking for a suspect with scratches on his face. Police reportedly questioned a man in Cannon City, Colorado, days later because he had scratches on his face. According to media outlets covering the story in 2020, police questioned other suspects in the months that followed, including James Charbondy. He served 25 years in prison for the murder of a sheriff's deputy and had stopped dating his parole officer around the time of Peggy's murder. The police did everything they could, but they simply ran out of other leads. Peggy's mother lived another 11 years, dying in 1974, never knowing who killed her eldest daughter. Investigators assigned to look into the murders of Girl Scouts Denise, Lori, and Michelle, as well as reporters covering the case, called the killer a beast. The brutality of the attack was evident in the victim's wounds. Catching the killer became a priority for the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation. Evidence found near the bodies included a large roll of black duct tape and a red and white 9-volt flashlight. The lens of the flashlight was covered with a piece of green film from a garbage bag. The perpetrator had used the tape to attach the green film to the flashlight. There was a piece of newspaper sandwiched between the battery compartment of the flashlight. It was dated April 17th and was a clipping from the Tulsa World. Investigators also discovered that someone had robbed some of the tents the night of the murders and taken, among other things, a pair of sunglasses belonging to counselor Susan Emery. The first suspect the investigation focused on was Jack Schroff, a rancher near Camp Scott. Duct tape was found in his home, as well as ropes similar to the one used to tie the 2 girls' hands. However, Schroff claimed that thieves had broken into his home and taken a number of items. He explained that the items found at the ranch were purchased to replace the stolen items. The man was asked to take a polygraph test, which he successfully did. He then had a solid alibi for the night of the murders, and as a result, he was no longer considered a suspect. Police checked with mental hospitals and state prisons for inpatient lists and sex offender histories. Then, Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation agent Arthur Linville became interested in a rapist and runaway whose mother lived less than a mile from Camp Scott. His name was Gene Leroy Sonny Hart. Hart was a Cherokee born on November 27, 1943, in Claremore, Oklahoma. He was raised by his mother and barely knew his father. He did not do well in school, but excelled in sports and was able to attend college on a football scholarship. Instead, he decided to get married, and soon he and his wife became parents. Up until then, Hart seemed happy, but something changed, and he became irritable and rude. In 1966, Hart confessed to kidnapping and abusing 2 pregnant women. He was sentenced to 3 10-year prison terms, but because the terms were to run concurrently, he was released early after only 28 months. In 1970, Hart was convicted of a series of home burglaries and sentenced to McAllister. In April 1973, he was transferred from McAllister to Pryor Creek so he could appear for a retrial for his 1966 crime. He escaped from prison but was recaptured a month later. He escaped again in September 1973 and was still at large when the girls were murdered 4 years later. 3 days after the murders, 2 squirrel hunters found a flour sack in front of a cave nearly 3 miles southwest of Camp Scott. Believing someone might be hiding in the cave, they contacted the highway patrol. Inside the cave, investigators found photographs of two women, a roll of duct tape with part of a garbage bag stuck to it, two pieces of newspaper, and broken sunglasses in a beige case. The newspaper turned out to be the April 17th issue of the Tulsa World, and counselor Susan Emery recognized her glasses. Investigators tracked down photographs from Dalloway Lynch's, who worked at the prison when Hart served time there. Lynch's worked as a photographer and worked on the pictures in the prison's darkroom. Hart helped develop the film. Dick Wilkerson, an agent with the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, theorized that Hart kept the pictures because one of the women reminded him of his wife. This gave police a connection between Hart and the case. The cave was linked to the crime scene, and Hart was linked to the cave. When the public learned that Hart was accused of murdering the girls, his friends and relatives who believed in his innocence rallied around him. He had 250 relatives living in the camp area who were eager to help him. Hart was also able to live off the riches of the land. The northeastern Oklahoma area offered plenty of fish and game and plenty of places to hide. Throughout the summer of 1977, Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation agents used dogs and tried to spot Hart from the air. They battled heat, humidity, and ticks, but it was as if they were chasing a ghost. One of the agents, Harvey Pratt, was a Cheyenne Arapaha and a strong believer in Indian mysticism. When Dick Wilkerson and his brother, Agent Mike Wilkerson, wrote a book about the Girl Scout murders, they quoted Pratt, "The Indian people in that part of Oklahoma believe that medicine men have potions so powerful that they can transform themselves into birds or animals, or give someone that power. Such people are called shapeshifters or metamorphs." Pratt and others who thought like him believed that Hart had a powerful potion that helped him. As the months passed, former football star Gene Hart became a living legend. At some point, the dogs came across another small cave about a mile away from the crime scene. In black ink, written on the wall of the cave, was June 17, 1977. The real killer was here. The sheriff believed the message was written by the killer, but this theory had many critics who did not believe that the killer would hide in the woods with black ink. But the sheriff said that if the cave was easy to find, I might think it was a hoax. But it was very difficult to get to, and we had a hard time finding it. Although the cave gave few clues, it supported the theory that the killer was hiding in the woods. In late September 1977, more than $20,000 had been raised from various sources, and that was enough for an informant to offer police help in capturing Hart. He told police that a relative of the suspect planned to take him to the Cherokee Reservation in North Carolina. The agents planted a tracking device on a relative's car, but the plan failed when one of Hart's supporters, who worked at police headquarters, reported the bug to his family. Throughout the winter, investigators spent long nights in the woods in sub-zero temperatures, continuing to monitor areas where they believed Hart might be hiding. Finally, they got a break. Their informant learned that Hart was living with an elderly man in a shack in the Cookson Hills, between the towns of Tahlequah and Salissa. On April 6, 1978, the agents surrounded and surprised Hart. Not a single shot was fired. The agents couldn't contain their joy. The hunt lasted 10 months, took more than 10,000 hours and $2 million in taxpayer money. Hart hid for 5 years in a 65 square kilometer area. Now the question arose, could the prosecution prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that Gene Leroy Hart was guilty of murder, or was the killer still at large? Before the trial, interest in the murder forced the prosecution to seek another venue for the trial, but the request was denied. The trial took place in March '79. Prosecutor Buddy Fallis Jr. was assigned to assist District Attorney Sid Wise, who was under scrutiny for his alleged intention to write a book about the case. Hart's defense was assigned to Garvin Isaacs. Not a single member of the jury that would decide Hart's fate was a Native American. The case against Hart got off to a rocky start, starting with the way police handled the crime scene. In the tent where the victims slept, investigators found a handprint and a bloody shoe print. The handprint turned out to belong to an Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation agent, and the shoe print was too small to be connected to Hart. A fingerprint found on a flashlight at the crime scene was not Hart's. The body fluid collected at the crime scene posed an unsolvable puzzle for the prosecution. Hart had undergone a vasectomy several years earlier and was theoretically incapable of producing semen. The prosecution argued that the vasectomy performed on Hart by the 78-year-old doctor was only partially successful. Doctors advising the prosecution in the case said such an incident could have resulted in unproductive body fluid. Hart had type O blood. He was also a secretor, meaning someone whose saliva and other body fluids contain traces of water-soluble agglutinogens that determine a person's blood type. The sample found on the victims came from a non-white male who was a secretor with blood type O and non-fertile seminal fluid. The number of people in the United States who met those criteria was negligible. Forensic experts also testified that a hair found on Denise was microbiologically identical to Hart. But this was before DNA testing, and the defense argued that similar meant just that, similar but not identical. Two key pieces of evidence were a souvenir corncob pipe and a small blue mirror found in a shack belonging to an old man named Sam Pigeon. Hart lived there with Pigeon after the murders. Karen Mitchell, a counselor at Camp Scott, identified the pipe and mirror as hers, claiming they had disappeared around the time of the murders. The problem was that investigators only seized the pipe and mirror after they decided to conduct a second sweep of the shack. Sam Pigeon said he had never seen the items. As a result, Hart's supporters and his attorney began to suspect that the evidence had been planted by agents desperate to close the case. Isaacs also questioned the work of Sheriff Pete Weaver. One of Weaver's former supervisors claimed to have seen some of Hart's belongings in Weaver's desk, things that later turned up in a cave allegedly used by Hart as one of his hideouts. The prosecution wrapped up its case in 6 days. Then the defense took the stand. In addition to attacking the forensics and the officers' actions, Isaacs introduced an alternative suspect, Bill Stevens, who, like Hart, was a convicted rapist. A woman named Joyce Ellen Payne and her common-law husband, Dwayne Peters, knew Stevens and said he had borrowed a red and white flashlight from them a few days before the murders, and they had seen him with what appeared to be blood on his shoes. He told the couple that his car had broken down in Locust Grove. Stevens denied the allegations, claiming he had never been in the area, yet Kimberly Lewis, a Girl Scout, testified that she had seen a man who looked like Stevens at camp. The prosecution countered by saying that hair and body fluid samples from Stevens ruled him out as a suspect. It was possible that other suspects were involved. Police saw strange men near the camp on the day of the murders, and suspicion grew that there was more than one perpetrator involved, as there were several victims. Interestingly, before the murders, camp staff found a threatening note. The note stated that several little girls would be killed. The camp director dismissed the incident as a joke and took no safety precautions. Hart did not testify at the trial. The jury retired for the night without reaching a verdict. The next morning, they were ready with a decision. Not guilty. Emotions were running high. Joy and relief on the part of the defense, sadness and disbelief on the part of the prosecution. The jury noted that the investigation was poorly conducted and there was insufficient evidence to convict without question. After the trial, Hart returned to prison to continue serving his sentence for robbery. Within a year, he died. The official cause of death was a heart attack. While Hart's trial was ongoing, the media speculated about whether the same Camp Scott employee might have once worked at the Colorado camp where Peggy Beck was murdered in 1963. But prosecutor Sid Weiss said they found no evidence to connect the two cases. In fact, not only could they not tie Hart to Peggy Beck, they could not even prove that Hart was guilty of murdering 3 Girl Scouts. It is easy to imagine that after a decade of uncertainty, Peggy's family, her father and sisters, probably believed they would never get answers. In 2007, biological material from Peggy's body was tested for DNA, and a DNA profile of the perpetrator was created. Investigators entered it into the FBI database. If the criminal was ever arrested and DNA was taken, it would be known. But the effort was in vain, and in 2007, that was the limit of DNA technology. Without a match, the criminal continued to elude prosecution. In 2009, Peggy's father died at age 88. He never found out who killed his daughter. Finally, in June 2019, Colorado detectives returned to the case and conducted a more comprehensive DNA analysis. The resulting profile allowed them to find a match. Investigators found a relative of Peggy's killer and were able to reconstruct the family tree, narrowing the number of suspects to a minimum. Detectives met with a family member, asked a few questions about the person's relatives, and the information they received led them to a likely suspect. James Raymond Taylor investigators confirmed that Taylor lived in Colorado in the early 60s. At the time of Peggy's murder, he was married and worked as a TV repairman. The guy was only 23 years old. The evidence was so compelling that police issued a warrant for Taylor's arrest and looked into his background. He had a record of offenses in Las Vegas dating back to the 1970s. They were also able to find out that Taylor had lived in Colorado in the early 1960s, the same time and city where Peggy and her family lived. However, they could not establish whether Taylor knew Peggy Beck or whether he could have been stalking her specifically. One theory was that Taylor simply stumbled upon the young counselor while doing his job. Perhaps they could ask him all the questions in person, but no, they can't because the police can't find him. Yes, they had a warrant out for his arrest for Peggy's murder in '63, but James Raymond Taylor had disappeared, and his family said he had been missing since the '70s. The last anyone knew of him was living in Las Vegas in '76. And after that, nothing. Peggy's parents didn't live long enough for the police to finally track down their daughter's killer, but her sisters have an answer to the question that's been plaguing them and can move on with their lives. Will parents Denise, Michelle, and Lori ever know for sure who attacked their daughters that fateful night in 1977? Was it Hart? Did he have an accomplice that the police never even suspected? And could it have been one of the most notorious serial killers in human history? Many believed and still believe that Hart was guilty of the crime, but the evidence supports the theory that he was not alone and had an accomplice. At the very least, that would explain the fingerprint that was found, which did not belong to Hart. It is difficult to imagine how Hart killed 3 girls alone, considering that no one heard the noise of 10-8. If there were at least 2 criminals, then it would be easier to guarantee silence. The media reported that the knots used to tie the girls' wrists looked different, suggesting that the knots were tied by different people. At the same time, the girls were attacked in different ways, which also suggests at least 2 attackers. The girls were found more than 100 meters from their tent, meaning they were carried there. Perhaps the perpetrator wanted to take them away from the camp, which was also not easy for one person. It is also strange that Hart, who had never killed anyone before, went on to kill 3 girls at once. And the brutality of the crime does not mean that it was the first such murder. In 2008, biological fluids found in the tent were examined for DNA using modern capabilities, but no answers were obtained due to the very old age of the samples being examined. However, the test showed the presence of female DNA. The test failed to rule out all 3 girls or the possibility of a female perpetrator, adding new questions rather than providing answers to the existing mystery. Lori's mother said, "I always felt there was a girl, so when I saw the DNA tests, it bothered me." Experts were finally able to rule out the possibility that it was Lori's DNA, as well as one of the other girls, but they couldn't rule out all 3. Given the DNA results, one wonders if a woman was involved in the murders. As recently as 2017, new Sheriff Mike Reed created a fund to raise money and conduct more DNA testing on the remaining samples, this time using even more advanced technology. The results of this venture are still unknown. It is also curious that, according to unconfirmed sources, Ted Bundy was in the area around the time of the murders. Could he have had anything to do with the case? He was never able to give a clear and precise answer to the question of how many people he killed. And the way the Girl Scouts were killed is a bit like his style. Yes, they were younger than his typical type, but couldn't he have simply taken advantage of the opportunity when it came his way? However, frankly speaking, this is the most unlikely version, if only because you would have to know that forest very well to hide there and wait, and then commit the crime in the dark with the help of a flashlight. Even the police officers who were looking for Hart at the time, veterans of the Korean and Vietnam Wars, got lost in the forest more than once in daylight, despite the help of dogs and helicopters. In any case, no one else was charged with the Scout murders. Ted Limke, an inspector with the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, said confidently that there was no need to keep the case open because the jury had let the man who committed the murder go free. Michelle, Lori, and Dennis were supposed to be in a safe place, enjoying the summer and meeting new people. It's unbearable to think of their families waiting for them 2 weeks later, with stories of incredible adventures at the camp and a desire to spend the remaining summer days with their loved ones. It's equally sad that Camp Scott closed after the murders and has stood abandoned and desolate ever since. It feels like the camp died with the girls in June of 1977. And the saddest thing is that, as the investigator in the case correctly noted, the simplest light bulb would have been enough to dispel the night darkness of the Camp Scott camp and prevent the tragedy that occurred.